It is great to see you all. I haven't seen many of you for quite some time, and there is a reason for that. I want to just let you know, I have temporarily relocated to Pennsylvania, and I'm going to be there for the next year. The reason is I've decided to go back and finish my PhD in mathematics, and I got a job as an adjunct professor of mathematics at a community college up there. And when you're working, at least in the math and sciences, when you're working on your PhD, you pretty much have to teach at the college level. And so I was able to get a job up there. So I'm going to be up there for about the next year. So I won't see you every week, but I will be back because whenever Larry needs someone to preach, I'm just going to fly down because on Allegiant, you can get a flight for about $50. So, hey, I'm just going to fly down. But I won't see you every week. In a year, I'll be back, and I'll see you guys every week. So, for those of you who've been here, you know that this is now the third week in the HIT series, which stands for High Intensity Training. And the purpose of this series is first to understand that just as getting your body conditioned for some extreme physical activity requires intense training, likewise, if you want to take on the extreme spiritual challenges of life, the challenges that require extreme faith or extreme spiritual maturity, that also requires training that would develop those spiritual aspects of your life first. And so the ultimate goal, then, of this series is for us to learn how to train for spiritual development that would result in extreme faith or spiritual maturity. And the first thing I'll tell you about that is that faith is a dynamic thing that in order to develop it, training for it, it means activity. It means making choices and having practices in your life that develop it. Your faith does not develop, it does not grow just because you come to church and sit in the pews. It doesn't work that way. Last week, Larry remarked that faith is really revealed by how you live your life. How you live your life. And that's absolutely correct. I've often told people that, that faith should be defined. It should not be defined this way. Faith is not what you just believe in the absence of evidence. And that's how some, critics of religion say it. Well, you just believe things with no evidence whatsoever. That's not faith. What faith is what you believe in enough to live for. Faith is what you believe in enough to make choices for, to change your life for, to live for, and to put your life on the line for. In 1859, Charles Blondin became the first guy to cross Niagara Falls on a tightrope. And he started at the American side. There were thousands of people there. He crossed from the American side over to the Canadian side, walked it in like 17 minutes flat, no problem whatsoever. He gets over there, people are cheering like crazy. And he says, all right, I want to ask a question. How many of you believe I can walk back across this tightrope with someone on my shoulders? And they all cheered and raised their hand. Yeah, they all raised their hand. They all believed he could do it. And then he asked a second question. Who will volunteer? No hands went up. And that, my friends, is the difference between belief and faith. Okay? So faith is something that you'll climb on top and risk your life for. All right? And so it is, by definition, it is something we live for. It is the way we live. We practice our faith. And so we want to talk about what that looks like. What are the actions that you take? What are the choices that you make in life to train for faith and spiritual maturity? And so to that end, we've been looking at the life of the prophet Elijah. At the events in his life that are recorded in 1 Kings, the 17th chapter. And you'll recall from the first 2 weeks, this is a time when there was a famine in the land that Elijah was a part of. He went to go live by a stream that God sent him to, but the stream ran dry. And so then he went to a little village where there was a widow and her son that had no food left, just a little bit. And he said, make me some food. And so she made him some food, and then God performed a miracle so that the food that she had just never ran dry. And so Elijah was living there with her. And so we're going to pick the story up from there. It's 1 Kings, the 17th chapter, and I believe it starts with the 17th verse. So it says, sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, what do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is truth." So this is a story of hope. It's a story of hope, that things can turn out okay. But there's some dynamics in this story that are common to the human experience and common to human behavior and how we respond, especially in tragedy. And I want to look at those dynamics. So that leads me to the first point, and it's this. When we are in the midst of adversity, we often blame others, blame ourselves, and blame God. Now, I want to start with the first 2 in that list. Blaming others and blaming ourselves. Now, you'll notice that in the very first passage that I just read, the widow sort of did both of those things at the same time. She started out saying, "What do you have against me, man of God?" So it was Elijah causing it. Elijah was causing this tragedy in her life. "What do you have against me, man of God? Have you come here to judge me because of my sin? So it's my fault. Yeah, I'm a sinner. I know I've done things wrong. This is my fault, right? And you've come to judge me for it." So she sort of did both of those things at the same time. Now, I want to start by saying that there is a sense in which blaming others for something and blaming yourself, maybe blame is not the right word there because it has a negative connotation, but there is a sense in which that can be appropriate. So, for example, if somebody really has perpetrated an injustice against you, let's say at work or something like that, it is fair for you to stand up for yourself. It is fair to call out injustice for what it is. That does happen. And it's okay for you to stand up for yourself and to call out injustice, because it would not be right to allow injustice to go without being confronted. So that's okay. Blaming yourself or just taking responsibility for your own mistakes is also a good thing. When you can, that's a hallmark of maturity, to recognize, you know what, I made a mistake, I did something wrong here, I created this situation, I need to take responsibility for it, learn from my mistakes, and then do something about it. So all of that is healthy. Here's where it becomes unhealthy, is when you use either of those first 2 dynamics to escape responsibility for the situation that you're in. Because even if it's true that somebody else is at fault for the adversity that you're facing, you're still going to be the one that has to do something about it. Even if it's your fault that you're in a particular situation, you're still going to have to do something about it. And very often, we do those 2 dynamics to escape responsibility. It's somebody else's fault. I'm angry, I'm resentful, it's somebody else's fault, and I shouldn't have to do anything about it because it's their fault. It's their fault. And we don't want to take any blame for ourselves, and so we shift the blame to somebody else. It's their fault, I'm angry, and I do nothing about it. It's injustice, I shouldn't have to do anything about it. Or, woe is me, yes, it's my fault, I'm just so unworthy, it's my fault, I'm a terrible person. It's self-deprecation. And again, in self-deprecation, if you deserve it, then you shouldn't do anything about it. I want you to notice how those 2 dynamics, when they become unhealthy, when they become dysfunctional, even though on the surface they look opposite, I'll blame someone else or I'll blame myself, actually have the same purpose. It is to relieve you of the responsibility of doing anything about the situation that you're in. The thing I've noticed over the years in counseling is people who this becomes their MO. And you've probably known people like this. Every time something goes wrong, if they can blame somebody else, they do. Every time. They blame somebody else. And you've probably known people who are just self-deprecating, all the time. I deserve it, I'm a terrible person. Well, when people do that, here's the thing that you notice about them. They are both perpetual victims. They're both perpetual victims. They live in the adversities and the trials of their life, and they never escape them because they never take responsibility for them. And when you can never escape the trials of life, when you can never escape the adversities of life, and indeed you prolong them because of your reactions, what happens then is hopelessness sets in. Despair sets in. There's no hope for the future. There's no hope for whatever potential might exist in your life, especially when this just becomes your natural reaction to every adversity. You live your life as a victim. You live your life in despair, and you live your life in hopelessness. And my friends, that is the opposite of faith. Faith brings hope, brings joy, brings potential. And that's the opposite. And so we can't live that way. Now let me address the third one, which was blaming God. And maybe you can see where I'm about to go with this. Well, blaming God is always inappropriate because God now is the ultimate scapegoat, right? Because if it's God who's causing the adversity in your life, you have no chance of escaping it. You deserve it, and God's causing it, and there's nothing at all that you can do about it. That is an escapist mentality, which is also a victim mentality, which leads to hopelessness and to despair. And it just allows you to escape the responsibility by blaming God. I want to tell you something right now that might rattle a lot of you. But this is the truth. I've learned this from 20 years of ministry and watching people try and live their lives for God, watching them as they live their lives and the actions they take, choices that they make. Here is the truth. Most of the bad fortune or the terrible things that happen in your life, things that you have no control over, most of the terrible things that happen in your life, and most of the wonderful things that happen in your life, things that you don't really have any control over, both of those things happen randomly. There is no reason for them. They just happen. When tragedy happens in your life, it's not because God is orchestrating some tragedy in your life because he wants to teach you some lesson or because you sinned and he's punishing you. When something wonderful happens in your life, some good fortune happens in your life, it's not because God's blessing you because you did the right thing and you loved him just the right way and you went to church enough. Those things just happen. And they happen to atheists and Buddhists and everybody else the same as they happen to Christians. Now, what I will tell you, though, is that just because much of life is random in that way, randomness does not mean without purpose and without meaning. And that's important to say because it's natural for us to think of randomness as just that. If something is random, it can't possibly have a purpose and it can't possibly have meaning. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, just in the sciences, if you want to do something like, let's say, you want to do a study and find out what's the average IQ of Americans, well, you can't stand out in front of the physics building at Princeton University as people walk in and randomly pick those people, right? You're not going to get the right, those IQ is going to be way higher. The study would have to be random. You'd have to be picking a random sample. And in the same way, our lives as we serve God and the fact that God has allowed this world and the things that happen in it to be random in the sense that he allows the laws of nature and physics to run things, that does not mean that those random things are without purpose. In fact, in some ways, they have more purpose. Here's why. Because when the tragedies of life strike, or the good fortunes of life strike, what gives them meaning is your response to them. You get to give meaning. You get to give purpose. So when the tragedies of life strike, you can either decide to be a victim, or you can decide to do something about it, to bring some kind of good out of it. When the good fortunes of life happen to you, you can decide to squander it on yourself, narcissistically, or you can decide to make the world a better place because of the good fortune that has taken place in you. And so it is your response that matters. That's what's important. And that's what builds spiritual maturity. That's what brings faith. That is the training. That's the training. In 1981, a little boy named Adam Walsh was abducted from a shopping mall. And 2 weeks later, they found him murdered. That name probably rings a bell, right? His father, John Walsh, a few years after that, started the TV show America's Most Wanted. Now, you can imagine, I can't imagine something worse than having your child abducted and murdered. I can't. Who could blame someone if that happened to them for spending the rest of their life angry at God, angry at the world, in despair, in resentment? You can imagine that just ruined their life, to spending the rest of their life angry. You can imagine that. That's not what John and his wife did. They decided to do something with the pain that was visited upon their life. And so he started that TV show. It was on the air for 23 years. That show was directly responsible for the arrest of 1,156 of the worst criminals in this nation over the course of that 23 years. And it was directly responsible for solving 550 unsolved crimes that the FBI was trying to solve. That's doing something positive with the tragedy in your life. And here's the beautiful thing. The poetic justice here is so beautiful. After being on the air for 20 years, one of the fugitives that they caught and captured, they very quickly discovered he was a pedophile. And this man that they captured after they were on the air for 20 years turned out to be the man that had abducted his son and murdered him. What beautiful poetic justice there. And Adam, or John Walsh, in an interview, he said, that was such a profound blessing. It was like it brought such beautiful closure for my wife and I, that the thing that we did not only helped so many people, but then in the end helped us too. And that's a response to tragedy. That was a choice that he made that gave the tragedy in his life, it gave it meaning. It gave it purpose. The tragedy was random. God didn't select John Walsh to have his son murdered. It was random. It just happened. It was a terrible thing. But John and his wife gave it purpose and meaning. And so this is an overarching point. It's not one of my 3 points. The overarching point is this, is that we have to see reality for what it is. We have to see reality for what it is and understand God's relationship to it and our relationship to it. And understand that. And so let me go to the next point. The next point is this. It's a short one. Know when to quit. Now, the reason I've got that up there, it sounds like it maybe doesn't fit. This is one of Warren Buffett's 10 rules for life. As you know, Warren Buffett is unbelievably successful. He's one of the richest men in the world. He's a billionaire. And one of his 10 rules is know when to quit. And he basically says this. He says, look, you know what? Sometimes you go into things and you're thinking it's going to work out well. You've done all your research, and it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. And he said there's a time, tenacity is a good thing. Courageousness is a good thing. That's all good, but there comes a time when you just need to know when to quit. You need to know when to change your goals. For many of us, the adversities that we face in life are precisely when our hopes and dreams and goals for something don't pan out, right? And there's a time to know when to change our goals. And this is where having a relationship with God, this is where meditation, reading your scriptures, getting good teaching at a church, making it your life to study and to understand this faith that you live out, to understand what is important to God, and understanding what you should have faith in, and to change the motivations of your heart by changing your mind, by understanding different things. So let me give you an example. Years ago, I was a musician. I was in a band and had hair almost down to my waist and, sex, drugs, rock and roll, That was me in the late 80s and early 90s, And the thing is I was a guitar player in the band, and I was a good guitar player. I mean, like Eddie Van Halen good. I was really, really good. The drummer that played with me, one of the best drummers I ever seen in my life, he could, on a xylophone, he could actually take sticks and he could play the melodies to like Mozart and Beethoven with the sticks. I mean he's an amazing drummer. And we were talented and, hey, we were going to make it because we were talented, right? Yeah, that didn't happen. Not at all, not even a little bit. And here's why. Over the years, I've discovered this because I've known musicians for years and years. In fact, my best friend spent almost his entire adult life, trying to break into the music business. Here's why it's so hard. It's so hard because almost nobody really cares about talent. People like certain music or whatever. It doesn't mean that the musicians who make that are super, super talented. It's just random. It's just what culture seems to like at the moment. As a matter of fact, if you were to get the top 1,000 best guitar players on the planet in this room, probably less than a half a dozen of them would have any fame whatsoever. Probably the top 10 best guitar players in the world, nobody knows you don't know who they are. The only people knows who they are is their family. So talent just doesn't really matter that much. Talent in the music industry, in saying, oh, you're going to make it because you're so talented, is like telling someone, oh, you're going to make it in the NBA because you're taller than 6'3". It's just, and the terrible thing about it is it's just who you know. It's just like, who just is willing to maybe give you a shot or whatever. And it's a dog-eat-dog business. Now, to be sure, you have to have some talent. If you have no talent, you have zero chance of making it, okay? But even with a lot of talent, it's no guarantee at all. There was a study done here just a few years ago, because in this day and age now, artists can just upload their music to like iTunes and to YouTube, and there's all these sort of platforms where musical artists can sort of be independent. That, instead of hoping that Warner Brothers Records will sign them, they can put their music up and hope that people will download it. And most of these platforms have a system where that after there's a certain number of downloads, you actually start making money. You actually start getting paid for the downloads. There has to be a certain number because, your family just downloads everything. So you got to have a certain number before they start giving you money, okay? But so the study looked at, okay, so for all of the musicians and artists who have music across all of these platforms, and it's been up for more than a year, how many of them are there, and what percentage of them have had enough downloads where they start making money? Well, the number of songs is mind-boggling. The number of songs across all those platforms was like in the neighborhood of 700 million songs on all of those platforms. The percentage of people who had received $0 because of their downloads was higher than 99.999%. Almost none of them had any downloads. Now, here's the thing. If you love music and, I want to make my living in music and I want to be a rock star. That was me. I wanted to be a rock star, That's discouraging. It's discouraging when you're the most talented guy around and you still can't get anybody to sign you. You can't seem to break into the business. That's very discouraging. And so, hopelessness that I talked about a moment ago, right? Well, that brings hopelessness, right? Maybe there's a time I just give up. I just go ahead and go into despair. No. What you have to do is change your mind about what's important. Because the question to ask yourself there is, God has created me as a creative person. There's a personality type who's just creative. And if you're creative that way, you want to do this. But the question is this, what's important to you? Fame and fortune or music? Because they're not the same. And so what you do is you change your mind and you realize, you know what? Here's what I'll have faith in. Here's the principle I'll have faith in. God's given me a gift. I'm going to lean into that gift. I'm going to develop that gift. I'm going to become the best musician or actor or whatever or painter that I can become. I'm going to lean into that gift. And when I lean into that gift, purely for itself, purely for the beauty of just leaning into that art and being the best that I can be at it, what I know is that will all my life bring me joy and bring me happiness. I've got to change what I have faith in. I gotta turn to the things that really are important, the things that really almost have a spiritual meaning and a base to them. And the fame and fortune isn't it. You just have to change what's important. And that's the idea here. In serving God, we have to come to a knowledge of, God, as I commune with you and I hear your voice in my heart, I have to come to a recognition of what reality is, face that reality, live within that reality, and you tell me that in that reality I can have joy and peace that surpasses understanding, and I can have meaning and purpose in my life. I can understand that life can be random, but that doesn't mean it's without purpose and without meaning. In fact, I get to give it meaning and purpose. I understand that I have to have faith in the right thing. I can't lean into the treasures of this earth. And see, this is why the scriptures say these things. You see the brilliance now, right? When Jesus says, don't build your treasures here on earth where moth and rust corrupt and thieves break in and steal, but build your treasures in heaven. In other words, the spiritual things. So if you're a musician striving for fame and fortune, that's building for the treasures of earth. Striving to be a great musician for the joy that it brings and the art of the craft for itself, that's striving for something that is eternal and spiritual. They're different. And so we're guided by these principles that teach us what to have faith in. And let me say that if you have faith in the wrong thing, if you're just convinced that what God does, everything that happens in your life, it's for some purpose because God's orchestrating it in your life. And so what's really happening then, what you have faith in, is that somehow God will just orchestrate the events in your life so that the circumstances of your life on the outside will be finally what you want, and you kind of don't have any power over it. You are going to be sadly disappointed many times in life. Here's a great example. This has been taught in churches for years, especially in evangelical churches. And it's taught to young people. Terrible. Here's what they're taught. God has the perfect person for you to marry. There's this one person out there that God has just for you. Just for you. In fact, some churches even got the bright idea of telling young people, and you know what you should do? You should start praying for that person right now. Even though you don't know them, you should start praying for their spiritual development, that things go good in their life. You should start praying for that. Now, I want us to just take a moment to think rationally about that. We would all agree, would we not, that humans, even the ones who love God, are capable of sinning. They're capable of just not obeying God and not doing His will. That much has to be obvious, right? So it's at least possible that some young Christian person, in not obeying God, ends up not marrying the person that God had for them, but marries somebody else instead because they just didn't do God's will. That's possible, right? That would have to be possible. But if that person marries the person they're not supposed to marry, then that means the person they were supposed to marry doesn't have anybody to marry. And so, by definition, the person that they marry will have to be the wrong person for them too. But if the person they marry is the wrong person for them, well, then that means that person married them, and that's the wrong person for them. So they're not marrying the person they're supposed to marry. And then that person doesn't have the right person to marry. So they're marrying the wrong person. And on it goes. One person disobeying God and not marrying the person that God had for them, that one person, means the whole system collapses. And nobody's married to the right person that they're supposed to be married to. Okay? That's ludicrous. God does not have one person for you to marry. There is no one perfect person for you to be with. Here's the deal. The deal is this. You love me. You're a Christian. Okay? Look for a person that has the right character, the right integrity, the right values to marry. There's thousands of them. Okay? Find one, and when they strike your fancy and you get along well and you decide to get married, now the hard work starts. Now you have to learn to love that person when they're unlovable, and they have to love you when you're unlovable, and you make a commitment to go through life together, loving each other in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, for better or worse, richer or poorer, and you go through life together, and that teaches you things and causes you to grow. That's the point. There's no one person for that. And when we understand that, we make much, much better choices in life. Having these sort of ludicrous beliefs that just God is orchestrating everything in life will always lead to your downfall. It will always lead to misery because in essence, it relieves you of responsibility. Your marriage should work because you married the right person. That's all. You married the person God wanted you to marry, so, everything should work. It relieves you, subconsciously, it relieves you of responsibility. And that's not how life is. So I want to end with this last point. The secret to having hope is not in denying reality, but rather accepting it and working within it. A few years ago, the denomination I worked for, the RCA, like most of the Christian denominations in the country, is seriously declining. They decided that they were going to go on this effort to plant churches. They were going to plant 5 churches in Florida, and they had a reserve of money, and they were going to put like $1 million into planting these 5 churches, right? And so we're having all these discussions about them, and lots of people at this point are saying, man, planting churches is hard, and they're not kidding. We're living in a nation where religion is on the decline, and people don't believe in it. Planting churches is really, really hard these days, especially when you have a little dinky church and they can go to some big church like this that has a rock climbing wall or something for their kids, It's just, it's hard to do. And so we're having all these discussions, and one of the guys who was going to be the pastor of one of those 5 churches, he said, I'm hearing all this about how hard it is and everything, but I want to say this. Yeah, it can be hard, but if God's in it, it's going to succeed. I remember distinctly him saying that. 5 years after starting those churches, all 5 of them had failed. Where was God? Where was God? It's this simple. God had no responsibility to grow those churches for them. And here's the deal. The deal is this. You go start a church, and it grows like crazy. Good fortune. You can leverage that to serve God, spread his message, and do a great thing. The church fails, and you have to close the doors. You serve God. You love God anyway. You find the meaning in that. And you continue serving God because that alone speaks volumes, even in the midst of failure. The deal is this. You agree to live for God and live in his principles, whether it fails or whether it blows up. That was their deal. And that's your deal. Pray with me. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for these truths. I thank you that you call us to recognize reality for what it is, and that you are not the God who shapes our outward circumstances to fit them the way we would like them to be as long as we just serve you. Instead, Lord, you're the God who has created a world that has much randomness in it. And terrible things can happen to Christians as well as atheists. And good fortune can happen to good people and to bad people. And Lord, what you tell us as your people is that what gives those things meaning and purpose is the way that we respond to them. And Lord, you teach us to respond in such a way that the response itself is what gives meaning and purpose. This is how we develop spiritually. This is how we work out. This is how we train spiritually. Lord, that when the storms of life come, no matter what damage the storm does, we continue living for you. We respond in the right way. And when the good fortune comes and the great weather comes, again, we respond in the right way. Lord, help us to live for you, not in exchange for some set of circumstances that we think you'll make for us, but rather live for you so that we can develop and become the people that you want us to be for all of eternity. Thank you for these truths, Lord. In your holy name we pray. Amen. I'll see you guys next week.